The Prince's Palace of Monaco. 700 years of rule. Not one family has escaped the curse. The Rock of Monaco rises 200 feet above the Mediterranean, crowned by a fortress that became a palace, that became a prison for every generation that tried to hold it. You see the changing of the guard, the white uniforms, the tourists photographing from the square, but beneath the ceremony lies a pattern darker than any fairy tale. Murder in the first generation, assassination in the third, poisoning, betrayal, forced marriages, and heirs who died before inheriting. The palace stands, the family bleeds. Grace Kelly, Hollywood's golden princess, dead at 52 in a car crash some say was no accident. Prince Rainier, who saved Monaco from bankruptcy, died alone and broken. Princess Charlene, married 3 times, widowed twice, one husband dead in a speedboat crash at 30. Prince Albert, unmarried until 42, fighting paternity suits and struggling to produce a legitimate heir. Princess Stéphanie, 3 marriages, constant scandal, a life that reads like punishment. Why does a palace built to project power instead consume everyone born within its walls? What is it about the Rock of Monaco that turns fairy tales into tragedies? If ruling the smallest nation in Europe brings such wealth and privilege, why has the Grimaldi family suffered losses that would destroy ordinary dynasties? The legend says it began with a curse in 1297. A witch condemned the Grimaldis to never find happiness in marriage. 7 centuries later, the pattern holds. Every generation proves it again. If you enjoy deep investigations into royal families and the palaces they cannot escape, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which royal dynasty to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. The Fortress and the Fraud, 1191 to 1297. In 1191, the Republic of Genoa needed a fortress. The Mediterranean coastline was contested territory, fought over by rival Italian city-states, foreign powers, and pirates who treated shipping lanes as personal hunting grounds. The Rock of Monaco, a limestone promontory jetting into the sea, offered strategic advantage that could not be ignored. Height, visibility, natural defenses. Build a fortress here, and you could control the coast for miles in every direction. The Genoese constructed exactly that, not a palace, not a residence for nobility, but a military installation. Thick stone walls, guard towers, minimal windows, provisions for siege. The fortress was functional, harsh, built to withstand attack rather than impress visitors. For the next century, it served its purpose. Genoese soldiers garrisoned the rock. They watched the sea. They protected Genoese interests. The fortress was property, not power, a tool, not a throne. Grace Kelly followed quickly. The settlement had barely existed. A few fishing families, some farmers on the hillsides. No government, no industry, no identity beyond being the place where the fortress stood. The rock mattered. The settlement did not. Power resided in Genoa, 120 miles east. Monaco was an outpost, nothing more. Then came the Grimaldis, and with them, the violence that would define 7 centuries. The Grimaldi family were Genoese nobility with a problem. They had backed the wrong side in Genoa's internal conflicts, supporting the Guelphs against the Ghibellines in the brutal factional wars that tore Italian city-states apart. By 1295, the Ghibellines had won. The Grimaldis were exiled, stripped of property, declared enemies of the state. They needed a base from which to rebuild. They needed a fortress they could hold against Genoese forces seeking revenge. François Grimaldi, known as Il Malicia, meaning the cunning one, looked at Monaco and saw opportunity. The fortress was lightly garrisoned. Genoese attention was focused elsewhere, on consolidating power at home and managing larger conflicts. If Monaco could be taken quickly, it could be held indefinitely. The question was how to take a fortress designed to resist siege. François chose deception over force. On the night of January 8, 1297, he approached the fortress gates dressed as a Franciscan monk. The disguise was perfect. Monks traveled constantly, sought shelter regularly, and aroused no suspicion. The guards saw robes and a staff, not a threat. They opened the gates. François struck immediately. His soldiers, hidden nearby, rushed the entrance. The guards were overwhelmed before they could raise alarm. Within minutes, the Grimaldis controlled the fortress. By dawn, they controlled Monaco. The Republic of Genoa awoke to discover they had lost a strategic position to the very family they had exiled. The taking of Monaco was brilliant military opportunism. It was also the founding act of a dynasty built on deception, violence, and the willingness to do whatever survival required. That willingness would be tested immediately and repeatedly for the next 7 centuries. Genoa wanted Monaco back. They sent forces to retake it in 1297, 1301, 1306. Each assault failed. The fortress that had been built to withstand attack from the sea proved equally effective against land forces. The Grimaldis held. But holding required constant vigilance, continuous spending, and alliances that came with their own costs. François Grimaldi did not live to see Monaco secure. He died in 1309, only 12 years after taking the rock. His son Rainier first inherited not a throne, but a contested fortress surrounded by enemies. Holding Monaco required everything the family had: resources, attention, lives. The rock demanded sacrifice from the beginning. By 1314, the Grimaldis had negotiated a fragile peace with Genoa. They would hold Monaco, but as vassals acknowledging Genoese suzerainty. It was not independence, it was survival. The family had gone from Genoese nobility to Genoese exiles to Genoese vassals controlling a fortress on a rock. Power, but always contingent, always threatened, always expensive to maintain. Through the 14th century, the Grimaldis expanded their holdings. They acquired Menton and Roquebrune, towns on the coast that gave Monaco depth beyond the rock. They built alliances through marriages, trading daughters and sons to families whose support they needed. They fought periodic wars with Genoa, with France, with local rivals who saw Monaco as a prize worth taking. The palazzo, it was not yet called a palace, began to change. Military necessity remained, but the Grimaldis added residential spaces, rooms for family, halls for administration, chapels for worship. The fortress was becoming a seat of power, not merely a defensive position. But it remained fundamentally a military structure. Walls defined everything. Security was primary, comfort was secondary. The family's motto, adopted in this period, was revealing: Deo Juvante, with God's help. They needed help. Monaco was tiny, perpetually threatened, and expensive to defend. The Grimaldi survived through cunning, alliances, and willingness to bend when force would break them. But survival is not prosperity. Survival is managing decline while hoping for better circumstances. By 1400, the Grimaldis had held Monaco for over a century. They had established a dynasty. They controlled a small but strategically valuable territory. They had survived repeated attempts to dislodge them, but they had also discovered the essential truth about Monaco. The rock could be held, but holding it consumed everything the holder possessed: money, attention, lives. The fortress stood, the family paid. The next 2 centuries would test whether any family could hold Monaco permanently, or whether the rock would eventually claim every dynasty that tried. The Centuries of Blood, 1400 to 1604. The 15th century opened with Monaco secure and the Grimaldis established, but security and establishment were not the same as stability. The family that had taken the rock through deception would discover that deception became the primary tool for taking it from them. Internal betrayals, assassinations, and succession disputes marked every generation. John I ruled Monaco from 27 to 54, 27 years of relative peace, rare for the era. He strengthened the fortress, expanded diplomatic relations, and died of natural causes at an advanced age. His son Catalan succeeded him. The pattern might have shifted toward normalcy. It did not. Catalan Grimaldi ruled only 3 years before being murdered in 1457, not by foreign enemies, not in battle, but by his brother Claudine's husband who wanted power. The assassination sparked a succession crisis that consumed the family for years. Claims and counterclaims, rival factions, violence in the palace itself. The fortress that protected Monaco from external threats could not protect the family from itself. Lambert Grimaldi, Catalan's cousin, seized control in 1458. His rule was contested immediately. He held Monaco by force, governing through intimidation and executions. Opposition to his rule grew within the family and among Monaco's small population. By 1494, he was dead. Poisoned according to some accounts, killed by illness according to others. The distinction mattered less than the pattern. Monaco's rulers were dying young, dying violently, dying before they could establish stable succession. John II took power in 1494. He married Antoinette de Savoy, forming an alliance with the House of Savoy that brought Monaco into larger European politics. The marriage produced an heir, Lucian, ensuring succession, but Lucian died in 1523 at age 27, unmarried and childless. The line that should have continued ended. Monaco passed to John's nephew, Augustine. Augustine ruled from 1523 to 1532, 9 years. He died suddenly at 37. His son Henri I inherited at age 10, requiring a regency that opened Monaco to outside influence. Honoré would rule for 49 years, from 1532 to 1581, the longest reign in Grimaldi history to that point. Stability seemed possible. The palazzo underwent renovations, becoming less fortress and more palace. Defensive walls remained, but interior spaces were refined. Monaco was not merely held, it was being civilized. But Honoré's long reign did not translate to dynastic security. His son Charles II succeeded him in 1581. Charles married Antoinette de Mercoeur, strengthening ties with French nobility. But Charles was weak where his father had been strong. He relied heavily on advisors, some of whom had agendas that conflicted with Grimaldi interests. His reign lasted only 7 years before his death in 1589 at age 39. His son Hercule succeeded at age 13. A child prince, again requiring regency, again opening Monaco to manipulation. Hercule would live to adulthood and rule until 1604, but his reign was marked by dependence on Spain, which had become Monaco's primary protector. Protection came with costs. Spanish troops garrisoned Monaco. Spanish advisors influenced policy. Monaco was technically independent, but practically a Spanish protectorate. The Grimaldis ruled, but always with Spanish permission. Through these 2 centuries, 1400 to 1600, Monaco developed its peculiar character, technically sovereign, but always dependent on larger powers. Ruled by Grimaldis, but often by minors requiring regents or adults relying on foreign advisors. The family held Monaco, but they did not control it in any absolute sense. They managed it, survived it, paid the price it demanded. That price was most visible in the family itself. Of the 10 Grimaldi rulers between 1400 and 1604, 5 died before age 40. 3 were murdered or suspected of being murdered. 2 inherited as children. Only one, Honoré I, lived to old age and died peacefully. The pattern was clear. Ruling Monaco was dangerous. Living in the palace was dangerous. Being a Grimaldi meant accepting that power came with a mortality rate that exceeded normal life expectancy. The palace itself evolved during these centuries. Military necessity shaped early construction, but by 1600, the palazzo was recognizable as a royal residence. The state apartments took shape, rooms designed for receiving ambassadors and conducting diplomacy. The Gallery of Hercules was commissioned, decorated with frescoes depicting Grimaldi history and Mediterranean mythology. The palace chapel was rebuilt in Renaissance style. Courtyards were added, bringing light and air into interior spaces that had been dark and cramped. Yet beneath the refinements, the structure remained fundamentally a fortress. Walls 20 feet thick in places, guard towers on corners, armories stocked with weapons, defensive positions maintained even as decorative elements softened the overall impression. The Grimaldis could not afford to forget what Monaco was, a small territory surrounded by threats, held by a family that had taken it through deception and kept it through constant vigilance. The financial strain was continuous. Monaco generated minimal revenue, fishing, some agriculture, tariffs on the small port, nothing approaching the costs of maintaining a palace, a garrison, diplomatic relations, and the constant necessity of bribing or rewarding allies. The Grimaldis supplemented Monaco's income through marriages, dowries brought cash infusions, and through service to larger powers. Spanish gold paid for Monaco's defense, but Spanish gold came with expectations. By 1604, the Grimaldis had held Monaco over 3 centuries. They had survived wars, plagues, internal betrayals, and succession crises that would have ended most dynasties. But survival was exhausting. The family was perpetually one generation from extinction, one assassination from chaos, one miscalculation from losing everything. The rock stood, the family bled, and the pattern showed no signs of breaking. The 17th century would bring new challenges: French ambitions, Spanish decline, and a Grimaldi prince who would make a decision that would haunt the family for generations. Honoré II became Prince of Monaco in 1604 at age 14, another child ruler, another regency. But Honoré would prove different from his predecessors. He would rule for 58 years, until 1662, and he would make the decision that defined Monaco's relationship with France for the next 3.5 centuries. Monaco in 1604 was a Spanish protectorate in everything but name. Spanish troops garrisoned the fortress, Spanish subsidies funded operations, Spanish policy dictated Monaco's diplomatic positions. The arrangement had provided security for decades, but it also meant Monaco had no independent foreign policy and limited internal autonomy. The Grimaldis were princes, but they governed with Spanish permission. By the 1630s, Spain was in decline. The 30 Years' War consumed Spanish resources. The empire that had dominated Europe for a century was overextended, financially strained, and losing its grip on territories it could no longer afford to protect. Monaco's strategic value had not changed, but Spain's ability to maintain its Mediterranean positions was weakening. France, meanwhile, was ascending. Cardinal Richelieu orchestrated Louis XIII's foreign policy with ruthless competence, expanding French influence through diplomacy backed by military force. France looked at Monaco and saw a Spanish position on the Mediterranean coast that could be turned. Honoré II, watching Spanish power erode, recognized an opportunity to switch patrons before circumstances forced a less favorable arrangement. In 1641, Honoré made his move. He signed the Treaty of Péronne, placing Monaco under French protection. The terms were similar to the Spanish arrangement: French troops, French subsidies, French influence, but the timing was Honoré's choice rather than something imposed by events. He negotiated from a position of relative strength, securing terms that preserved Grimaldi rule while acknowledging French suzerainty. The decision was pragmatic and arguably necessary, but it also locked Monaco into a relationship with France that would persist for centuries and would periodically threaten Grimaldi's sovereignty. France was a more powerful protector than Spain. France was also a more demanding one. The palace continued its transformation during Honoré II's reign. Italian architects were commissioned to redesign interior spaces. The state apartments were expanded and decorated in Baroque style. Marble was imported for floors and columns. Frescoes covered ceilings. Gilding highlighted architectural details. The palazzo was becoming a palace in the full sense, a residence worthy of a prince who engaged with Europe's major courts. But the costs were staggering. Renovation alone consumed fortunes. Maintaining diplomatic presence in Paris, Madrid, Rome, and other capitals required staff, gifts, and entertainment expenses that Monaco's revenues could not support. Honoré relied heavily on French subsidies and on loans from Italian banking families. The palace looked prosperous. The principality was deeply in debt. Honoré II died in 1662, having ruled longer than any Grimaldi before him. His grandson, Louis I, succeeded him. Louis was already 41 years old, having waited decades to inherit. His reign lasted only a decade before his death in 1672. His son, Antoine I, ruled for just 9 years, dying in 1681 at age 36. Monaco was back to the pattern of short reigns and early deaths. Louise Hippolyte Grimaldi became Monaco's first officially reigning princess in 1731. Her father had no sons, so she inherited directly, but contemporary attitudes about female rulers meant her husband, Jacques de Goyon-Matignon, exercised actual power. He took the Grimaldi name and ruled as Jacques I. Louise Hippolyte lived less than a year after inheriting, dying in 1731 at age 48. Her brief reign was essentially her husband's regency. Jacques I ruled until 1733, continuing the French alliance and the expensive maintenance of a court that Monaco could not afford without subsidies. He died after just 2 years, and his son, Honoré III, inherited at age 13. Another child prince, another regency. The pattern persisted. Honoré III would rule Monaco for 62 years, from 1733 to 1795, the longest reign in Grimaldi history. But length did not mean security. His rule coincided with the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, and ultimately the French Revolution that would destroy Monaco's status entirely. Through the early decades of his reign, Honoré III continued policies established by his predecessors: maintain the French alliance, renovate the palace, project power through display even when actual power was limited. He married Catherine Brignole, an Italian noblewoman whose dowry temporarily relieved Monaco's financial pressure. The marriage produced an heir, Honoré, ensuring succession. But as Honoré III aged, France's political situation destabilized. Louis XVI's government faced bankruptcy and political crisis. By the 1780s, revolution was brewing. Monaco, as a French protectorate ruled by a hereditary prince, was exactly the kind of anachronistic entity revolutionary ideology opposed. The Grimaldis had survived for 5 centuries by adapting to circumstances. The French Revolution would present circumstances that could not be adapted to. In 1789, the French Revolution began. By 1793, France was a republic that had executed its king and was exporting revolution across Europe. Monaco, with its hereditary prince and aristocratic government, was declared incompatible with republican principles. French revolutionary forces occupied Monaco. The principality was absorbed into France as part of the Department of Alpes-Maritimes. The Grimaldi Palace was seized. Honoré III was arrested and imprisoned. For the first time in 5 centuries, the Grimaldis did not rule Monaco. The palace stood, but the family was gone, exiled, imprisoned, stripped of power and property. The French Revolution had accomplished what 5 centuries of wars, assassinations, and dynastic struggles had not. It had ended Grimaldi rule. Or so it seemed. The family that had survived everything would survive this, too, but the cost would be measured in decades of exile, lost revenues, and a return to power that would come with conditions that permanently constrained Monaco's sovereignty. The French revolutionary government that seized Monaco in 1793 was thorough. The principality was not merely occupied, but legally dissolved. Monaco ceased to exist as a sovereign entity. It became French territory, administered by French officials, subject to French law. The Grimaldi family's property was confiscated. Their titles were abolished. The palace was repurposed as a hospital, then as barracks, stripping it of furnishings and artwork accumulated over centuries. Honoré III, the prince who had ruled for 60 years, was imprisoned in Paris. He was 73 years old, too old to pose any realistic threat to revolutionary France. But his title and history made him a symbol of the aristocratic order the revolution was destroying. He survived imprisonment, but was broken by it. Released in 1795, he lived only one more month before dying in Paris, far from Monaco, stripped of the power that had defined his life. His son, also named Honoré, became the titular Honoré IV upon his father's death, but he ruled nothing. He possessed a title France did not recognize and a principality that no longer existed. He lived in exile, moving between Italy and France, depending on which location was safer. His income came from what family wealth remained, loans from supporters, and the hope that political circumstances would eventually shift. They did shift repeatedly, but never in ways that restored Monaco quickly or completely. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power in 1799 brought stability to France, but did not change Monaco's status. Napoleon had no interest in restoring small principalities. He was building an empire, consolidating power, eliminating the fragmented political map that had characterized pre-revolutionary Europe. Monaco remained part of France throughout Napoleon's reign. Honoré IV died in 1819, having spent his entire nominal reign in exile. His brother Honoré V succeeded to a title without territory. The family situation was desperate. 2 decades of exile had consumed remaining resources. Properties in France had been confiscated and sold. Income from Monaco, which had always been minimal, was completely gone. The Grimaldis were nobles without a state, princes without a palace, surviving on the charity of relatives and the fading possibility of restoration. The possibility began to materialize in 1814. Napoleon was defeated and exiled to Elba. The Congress of Vienna convened to redraw Europe's map, restoring monarchies and principalities that revolution had swept away. The Grimaldis lobbied intensely for Monaco's restoration. They had history on their side, 5 centuries of rule. They had legitimacy, hereditary succession recognized across Europe. What they lacked was power to enforce their claims. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1814, restored Monaco to Grimaldi rule, but restoration came with conditions that permanently altered Monaco's status. The principality would not be fully sovereign. It would be a protectorate of the Kingdom of Sardinia, which itself was reconstituted as Piedmont Sardinia under the House of Savoy. Monaco would have autonomy in internal affairs, but foreign policy, defense, and ultimate sovereignty rested with Sardinia. Worse, the restoration did not include all previous Grimaldi territories. Menton and Roquebrune, towns that had provided much of Monaco's limited revenue, remained under dispute. The Grimaldis claimed them, but Sardinia's support for those claims was lukewarm. Without Menton and Roquebrune, Monaco was reduced to the rock itself and immediate surroundings, less than 1 square mile, too small to be viable without external support. Honoré V returned to Monaco in 1814 to find a palace gutted by 20 years of revolutionary use. Furnishings were gone, artworks had been sold or destroyed, walls needed repair, systems had deteriorated from neglect. The fortress that had survived 5 centuries of wars had been devastated by 2 decades of revolutionary occupation. Restoring the palace would cost a fortune. Monaco had no fortune. It barely had a treasury. The principality's finances were catastrophic. No revenue had been collected during exile. Debts accumulated. The Sardinian protectorate provided some support, but expected Monaco to largely fund itself. The traditional sources of income, tariffs, fishing rights, agricultural taxes, generated perhaps 20,000 francs annually, not 20,000 per month, per year. That was insufficient to maintain a palace, pay administrative staff, and fund the diplomatic presence expected of a prince. Honoré V spent his brief reign, 1819 to 1841, simply trying to stabilize Monaco enough to pass something functional to his successor. He negotiated constantly with Sardinia over Menton and Roquebrune. He borrowed heavily to fund palace repairs. He sold family properties in France to raise cash. He lived modestly by princely standards, avoiding the expensive court life that had characterized earlier reigns. But modesty could not close the gap between Monaco's needs and Monaco's resources. He died in 1841 without solving the fundamental problem. Monaco was too small, too poor, and too constrained by the Sardinian protectorate to function as a truly independent state. His brother, Florestan I, inherited this impossible situation and would struggle with it for 15 years before his son discovered the only solution that could work. Turn Monaco into something other than a traditional principality, transform it from a hereditary territory into a business. But before that transformation could happen, Monaco would lose even more territory and face near extinction as a political entity. Florestan I became Prince of Monaco in 1841, facing problems that seemed insurmountable. The principality was effectively bankrupt. The palace required repairs that could not be funded. Menton and Roquebrune, the territories that generated most of Monaco's income, were increasingly restive under Grimaldi rule. And the Kingdom of Sardinia, Monaco's protector, was more interested in Italian unification than in supporting a tiny principality that contributed nothing to Sardinian strategic interests. Florestan was not incompetent, but he was overwhelmed. He had not been raised expecting to rule. His older brother, Honoré V, had sons who should have inherited, but those sons died young, and Florestan, who had spent his life in theater and arts in Paris, suddenly found himself responsible for Monaco's survival. He returned reluctantly, took up a role he never wanted, and discovered that goodwill could not overcome structural impossibility. The financial situation deteriorated through the 1840s. Monaco's annual revenue barely covered basic operations. The palace staff was reduced to essential personnel. Diplomatic representation was minimal. The prince lived simply, in marked contrast to the elaborate court maintained by his 18th century predecessors. But even living simply required more money than Monaco generated. By 1848, revolution swept Europe again. France overthrew Louis Philippe. Italy erupted in nationalist movements demanding unification. Sardinia went to war with Austria. In this chaos, Menton and Roquebrune saw an opportunity. If the old order was collapsing everywhere, why should they remain under Grimaldi rule when Monaco could offer them nothing? In February 1848, Menton and Roquebrune declared independence. They formed free cities, refusing to pay taxes to Monaco and rejecting Grimaldi's sovereignty. Florestan had no military force to reclaim them. The Sardinian protectorate, focused on larger conflicts, would not intervene on Monaco's behalf. The territories that had provided 80% of the principality's revenue were simply gone. Monaco's annual income collapsed from 20,000 francs to less than 4,000. 4,000 francs could not maintain a palace, could not pay staff, could not fund basic government operations. Monaco was not merely in crisis. Monaco was non-viable as a political entity. Florestan considered options. He could appeal to other European powers, but none would intervene against Sardinia, Monaco's supposed protector. He could try to negotiate Menton and Roquebrun's return, but the cities had popular support for independence and no incentive to rejoin Monaco. He could abdicate, ending Grimaldi rule peacefully, or he could hold on, hoping circumstances would somehow shift in Monaco's favor. He chose to hold on, though it meant presiding over Monaco's slow dissolution. Through the 1850s, the principality barely functioned. Government operations were skeletal. The palace continued deteriorating. Prince Florestan lived in a few rooms while entire wings sat empty and decaying. Monaco had become a ghost state, technically sovereign, but effectively non-existent. Florestan's son, Charles, watching his father struggle, reached a different conclusion. Monaco could not survive as a traditional principality. The territory was too small, the resources were too limited, the geopolitical situation offered no advantages. But Monaco had one asset that had never been fully exploited: its location. Mediterranean coast, mild climate, beautiful setting. What if Monaco became not a principality that happened to have nice weather, but a resort that happened to be sovereign? The idea was radical for the era. Sovereignty was about territory, military power, and dynastic legitimacy. Turning sovereignty into a business proposition, charging wealthy tourists for the privilege of visiting a prince's domain, was almost unprecedented. But Charles saw no alternative. Monaco could hold on to tradition and disappear entirely within a generation, or it could transform into something new and possibly survive. He began planning while his father still ruled, quietly because Florestan would never approve such a fundamental transformation of Monaco's identity. Charles studied European resort towns, learning what attracted wealthy visitors. He consulted with architects about developing Monaco's coastline. He explored gambling as a revenue source, noting how successful casinos had become in German spa towns. An idea began forming. Monaco could become a Mediterranean playground for Europe's wealthy, a place where people came to spend money the principality desperately needed. In 1856, Florestan died at age 66, worn out by years of managing an impossible situation. Charles III inherited at age 37 with a clear plan and the determination to execute it regardless of opposition. He would save Monaco by abandoning everything Monaco had been for 5 centuries. The fortress would become a palace for tourists to photograph. The principality would become a business. Sovereignty would become a marketing advantage rather than a military claim. It was the only option available, but it required 2 things Charles did not yet have: capital to develop the infrastructure Monaco needed to attract tourists, and resolution of Monaco's relationship with surrounding powers so development could proceed without constant political interference. The capital problem would eventually be solved by a French businessman named François Blanc, who would build the Monte Carlo casino and transform Monaco into the gambling capital of Europe. But first, Charles needed to settle Monaco's borders and relationship with France permanently. That meant making a deal that would hurt deeply but ensure survival. In 1860, Charles negotiated the Treaty of Turin with France. Under its terms, Monaco would finally renounce all claims to Menton and Roquebrun. Those territories would become part of France. In exchange, France would recognize Monaco's sovereignty within its reduced borders, provide financial compensation for the lost territories, and guarantee Monaco's independence. The compensation was 4 million francs, a huge sum for Monaco, but barely adequate given what was being surrendered. Monaco shrank from about 7 square miles to less than 1 square mile. The territory that had sustained the principality for centuries was gone. The Grimaldis would rule approximately 500 acres of coastline and rock. That was all that remained of 5.5 centuries of expansion, contraction, and survival. But that 500 acres, properly developed, could generate more revenue than Menton and Roquebrune ever had. Charles III believed it. He had to, because there was no alternative. Monaco would become a resort and casino destination, or Monaco would cease to exist. The transformation was about to begin, and with it, the Grimaldis would discover that surviving by becoming a business created different problems than surviving as a traditional monarchy, problems they are still dealing with today. Charles III needed capital and expertise Monaco did not possess. He found both in François Blanc, a French businessman who had made a fortune operating casinos in Bad Homburg, Germany. Blanc understood the business of extracting money from wealthy people who came seeking entertainment, status, and the thrill of gambling. He had developed the systems, trained the staff, and created the atmosphere that made Bad Homburg profitable. Charles wanted him to do the same for Monaco. In 1861, Blanc negotiated a concession with Monaco, granting him exclusive rights to operate casinos in the Principality for 50 years. In exchange, Blanc would pay Monaco a percentage of casino revenues, fund infrastructure development, and build the facilities that would make Monaco a destination rather than merely a location. The deal was extraordinary. Monaco was essentially licensing its sovereignty to a private businessman who would use it to create a gambling empire. But Charles had few options. Monaco needed immediate cash to avoid bankruptcy. Traditional revenue sources were gone with Menton and Roquebrune. The Principality could not develop resort infrastructure without capital it did not have. Blanc's offer provided both immediate funding and long-term revenue. The cost was surrendering control over Monaco's economic development to an outsider for half a century. Blanc began construction immediately. His first priority was access. Monaco was isolated, reachable only by difficult roads that wealthy tourists would not travel. Blanc lobbied French authorities to extend the railway from Nice to Monaco. The line opened in 1868, cutting travel time dramatically and making Monaco accessible to Europe's wealthy classes. The railway was Monaco's lifeline. Without it, the casino plan would have failed completely. Next came the casino itself. Blanc hired architects to design a building that would announce Monaco as a destination for serious gamblers, not a provincial operation for locals. The Casino de Monte Carlo, designed by Charles Garnier, who would later design the Paris Opera, opened in phases starting in 1863 and reaching its full grandeur by 1878-79. The building was spectacular. Baroque architecture, lavish interiors, gaming rooms decorated to evoke European palaces. The casino was not merely a place to gamble, it was theater, performance, a stage where wealthy visitors could see and be seen. Blanc understood that successful casinos depended on creating an entire ecosystem around gambling. People needed places to stay, eat, and entertain themselves between sessions at the gaming tables. He funded the construction of luxury hotels. The Hôtel de Paris opened in 1864, offering accommodations that matched the finest hotels in Europe. Restaurants were established, managed by celebrated chefs. Gardens were landscaped. The waterfront was developed. Monaco was being transformed from a failing principality into a purpose-built resort town. The financial model was brilliant in its simplicity. Wealthy tourists came to Monaco for the casino, attracted by gambling's combination of entertainment and status. While there, they spent money on hotels, restaurants, shopping, and entertainment. All of those businesses paid taxes or concession fees to Monaco's government. The principality became profitable not despite being tiny, but because it was tiny. Every visitor was concentrated in a small area where Monaco could capture economic activity efficiently. By 1870, the plan was working. Casino revenues were substantial and growing. Monaco's government revenue had exceeded pre-1848 levels despite having lost most of its territory. Charles III was solvent for the first time in his reign. The principality's transformation was complete. Monaco was no longer a traditional monarchy surviving on tariffs and feudal obligations. It was a business built on wealthy people's desire for entertainment. But success created new problems. Monaco's transformation into a casino state generated moral opposition from conservative and religious circles across Europe. The Catholic Church condemned gambling as sinful. Many European countries banned their citizens from visiting Monaco or made it socially unacceptable. Monaco was becoming wealthy, but also notorious. The principality that had struggled for survival was now surviving through activities that much of Europe considered immoral. Charles III navigated this criticism by positioning Monaco as a special case. The principality was not encouraging gambling among its own citizens. Monegasques were banned from the casino. Monaco was providing a service to wealthy Europeans who would gamble regardless, doing so in a regulated environment rather than illegal establishments. The argument was pragmatic rather than moral, but it worked well enough to maintain Monaco's relationships with neighboring powers. The prince's palace benefited directly from casino revenues. For the first time in decades, comprehensive renovations were funded. The state apartments were restored, the throne room received new furnishings and decorations, the palace chapel was renovated, gardens were redesigned and planted with exotic species that thrived in Monaco's Mediterranean climate. The fortress that had decayed during the mid-19th century was transformed into a showplace that tourists could visit, adding another revenue stream and enhancing Monaco's image as a unique destination. Charles III also understood that Monaco needed cultural legitimacy to balance its reputation as a gambling destination. He established the Monte Carlo Opera, bringing world-class performances to the principality. The opera house became a social hub where European aristocracy and wealthy bourgeoisie could enjoy culture while visiting the casino. The combination was irresistible. Gamble in the evening, attend opera at night, enjoy the Mediterranean climate during the day. Monaco offered a complete luxury experience. By the 1880s, Monaco had achieved something remarkable. A principality that had been on the verge of extinction in 1860 was now prosperous, famous, and secure. Casino revenues funded a level of government services that far exceeded what traditional tax revenues could have supported. Monaco's citizens paid no income tax. The principality was funded entirely by revenue from visitors. This created a social contract unique in Europe. The Grimaldis would rule, and Monegasques would benefit from prosperity generated by outsiders gambling their wealth away. François Blanc died in 1877, having transformed Monaco through his casino concession. His son Camille continued operating the casino until the concession passed to a company structure. But the fundamental model remained unchanged. Monaco's survival depended on maintaining its appeal as a luxury destination where wealthy Europeans came to spend money. Charles III died in 1889 at age 71, having saved Monaco through the most radical transformation any European principality had ever undertaken. He inherited a nearly bankrupt microstate and left a prosperous resort principality. His success came at a cost. Monaco's identity as a traditional monarchy was permanently altered, but the alternative had been extinction. The Grimaldis survived by adapting. Again. His son, Albert I, inherited a very different Monaco than any previous Grimaldi prince had ruled. Prosperous, yes, but also fundamentally dependent on a business model that required continuous reinvestment, constant marketing, and the maintenance of Monaco's image as a place worth visiting. The fortress that had been held through military force for 5 centuries now needed to be sold through public relations, a new kind of challenge for a very old dynasty. Albert I became Prince of Monaco in 1889 at age 41. Unlike his father, Charles III, who had been forced to transform Monaco into a casino state to ensure survival, Albert inherited a prosperous principality. Casino revenues were substantial and growing. Monaco's reputation as a luxury destination was established. The immediate crisis had passed. Albert had the luxury his father never enjoyed, the ability to think beyond mere survival. He chose to use that luxury for science. Albert I would become known as the Scholar Prince or the Navigator Prince, dedicating much of his reign to oceanography, anthropology, and paleontology. He funded scientific expeditions, established research institutions, and became a respected figure in academic circles. His passion for knowledge was genuine, but it also served Monaco's interests by giving the principality cultural credibility beyond its reputation as a gambling destination. In 1889, Albert purchased a research yacht, the Hirondelle, and began conducting oceanographic expeditions in the Mediterranean and Atlantic. Over the next 3 decades, he would own 4 research vessels, each more advanced than the last. He personally participated in expeditions, diving to observe marine life and collecting specimens. His scientific work was published in academic journals and earned him membership in learned societies across Europe. The Oceanographic Museum of Monaco, which Albert founded and built between 1899 and 1910, became one of the Principality's most important cultural institutions. The museum was not merely a tourist attraction, though it served that purpose. It was a serious research institution with laboratories, aquariums, and collections that contributed to scientific understanding of marine biology. Albert positioned Monaco as a place where science and luxury coexisted, where wealthy visitors could gamble in the evening and learn about the natural world during the day. But Albert's personal life was far less successful than his scientific pursuits. His first marriage to Lady Mary Victoria Hamilton in 1869 was unhappy from the beginning. The couple had one son, Louis, in 1870, but the marriage dissolved amid incompatibility and scandal. Mary Victoria left Monaco, and the marriage was eventually annulled. Albert's second marriage to Alice Hine in 1889 lasted longer but was also troubled. Alice was an American heiress who brought wealth and social connections to Monaco, but the couple grew apart over time. They separated in 1902, though they never formally divorced. Albert's son, Louis, was a particular problem. Louis had no interest in Monaco's administration, no patience for the diplomatic work that princehood required, and no ability to produce a legitimate heir. He married twice, both marriages failing. His personal life was chaotic, marked by affairs, financial mismanagement, and behavior that embarrassed the principality. Albert recognized early that Louis would be an inadequate successor, but hereditary succession offered no alternatives. Louis would inherit regardless of competence. The relationship between Albert and Louis deteriorated through the 1890s and 1900s. They disagreed on policy, on palace management, on virtually everything. Louis wanted the privileges of princehood without the responsibilities. Albert wanted an heir who would continue his work of giving Monaco legitimacy beyond the casino. They had incompatible visions and incompatible personalities. The palace became a site of constant tension between a scholarly prince trying to build institutions and a dissolute heir undermining that work through personal scandal. Albert's reign also saw Monaco navigate the dangers of World War I. The principality declared neutrality, but neutrality was complicated when you were surrounded by France and dependent on French goodwill. German and Austrian aristocrats who had frequented Monaco before the war were now enemies. Allied powers pressured Monaco to demonstrate loyalty. The casino's revenues declined as European aristocracy stopped traveling during wartime. Monaco survived the war, but the experience demonstrated how vulnerable the principality remained despite its prosperity. One shift in French policy could end Monaco's independence overnight. Through the war years and their aftermath, Albert continued his scientific work, but he was increasingly focused on succession. He was aging. Louis was unsuitable. Louis had no legitimate children. The Grimaldi line faced a potential crisis. If Louis died without a legitimate heir, the succession would become contested. Multiple branches of the family could claim the throne. Worse, France might use a succession dispute as justification to absorb Monaco entirely. The solution came in 1920 when Louis finally produced a grandson through an illegitimate relationship. The child, born to a woman Louis had never married, was named Rainier. Louis had 2 children from this relationship, Charlotte and Rainier, but neither were legitimate heirs under Monaco's constitution. Albert faced a choice: change the constitution to legitimize Charlotte and establish her as Louis's heir, or allow the succession to pass to a distant branch of the family after Louis's death. Albert chose to legitimize Charlotte. In 1920, he issued a sovereign ordinance recognizing Charlotte as Louis's daughter and placing her in the line of succession. It was an extraordinary move, effectively rewriting dynastic law to preserve Grimaldi rule. But Albert understood that Monaco's survival required continuous Grimaldi sovereignty. A succession dispute would be catastrophic. Legitimizing Charlotte prevented that disaster, even if it meant bending rules that had governed royal succession for centuries. Albert I died in 1922 at age 73, having ruled Monaco for 33 years. He had maintained the prosperity Charles III had created, added cultural and scientific institutions that gave Monaco legitimacy, and navigated World War I without losing Monaco's independence. But he had also failed to prepare an adequate successor. Louis II, who inherited in 1922, was 52 years old and had never demonstrated competence in governance. The reign ahead would be difficult for Monaco and painful for the Grimaldis. Louis II became Prince of Monaco in 1922, and immediately the problems Albert I had anticipated became reality. Louis had no interest in the administrative work of running a principality. He had no diplomatic skills. He had no vision for Monaco's future. What he had was a title, a palace, and the expectation that casino revenues would continue funding a lifestyle he had grown accustomed to during his father's reign. The 1920s were prosperous for Monaco despite Louis's inadequacies. Europe recovered from World War I, the wealthy returned to Monaco's casino and hotels. The Roaring Twenties were particularly good for gambling destinations, and Monaco benefited from a surge in visitors seeking entertainment and luxury. Casino revenues reached new heights. Monaco's government had surplus funds that allowed expansion of services and further development of the principality's infrastructure. But prosperity hid deeper problems. Louis was content to let managers and advisors run Monaco while he enjoyed the privileges of princehood. This worked during good times, but it meant Monaco had no real leadership preparing for challenges ahead. The management structure that had developed under Albert I continued operating, but without princely direction or vision. Monaco was functioning on institutional momentum rather than active governance. Louis's daughter Charlotte, legitimized by Albert I in 1920, was married in 1920 to Prince Pierre de Polignac, a French aristocrat. The marriage was arranged to strengthen Monaco's ties with French nobility and to provide Charlotte with a husband suitable for her role as eventual ruler. The couple had 2 children, Princess Antoinette in 1920 and Prince Rainier in 1923. Rainier's birth secured the succession. Monaco would have a male heir for the next generation. But Charlotte had no desire to rule. She found court life stifling, her marriage unhappy, and Monaco's duties oppressive. By 1944, she would renounce her rights to the throne in favor of her son Rainier, preferring private life to public responsibility. This meant Rainier would eventually inherit directly from his grandfather, Louis II, bypassing his mother entirely. The 1930s brought global depression that affected Monaco less than most places, but still created challenges. Wealthy visitors continued coming, but in smaller numbers and spending less. Casino revenues declined. Monaco's government had to tighten budgets and reduce spending. Louis II, who had never been engaged with governance, was even less capable of responding to economic crises. The principality survived through institutional competence rather than princely leadership. World War II placed Monaco in an impossible position. The principality declared neutrality again, but Italy occupied Monaco from 1941 to 1943, followed by German occupation from 1943 to 1944. Louis II attempted to maintain Monaco's sovereignty throughout, but his ability to resist occupying powers was limited. He cooperated with occupiers to prevent worse outcomes, a pragmatic stance that nevertheless left Monaco complicit in Axis occupation of southern France. The war years were devastating for Monaco's economy. Tourism stopped entirely. The casino closed. Revenue collapsed to near zero. Monaco survived on reserves and on quiet financial support from wealthy Monegasques who understood that the principality's dissolution would cost them far more than supporting it through the war. By 1944, when Allied forces liberated Monaco, the principality was financially exhausted and its reputation damaged by wartime cooperation with Axis powers. Louis II was aging and increasingly infirm. His grandson, Rainier, now in his early 20s, had been educated in Switzerland and England, studying political science and gaining exposure to modern governance. Rainier had also served in the French military during the war's final year, establishing credentials that would be important for Monaco's relationship with France. He was being prepared for succession, though when that would occur was uncertain given Louis's continued survival despite declining health. Through the late 1940s, Monaco struggled to recover from the war. Tourism resumed slowly. The casino reopened but attracted fewer visitors than before the war. Europe was rebuilding, and luxury travel was not a priority for most people. Monaco needed to reinvent itself again, updating its appeal for a post-war world where old aristocracy was declining and new wealth was emerging. But Louis II was incapable of leading that reinvention. He died in 1949 at age 79, having ruled Monaco for 27 years without ever truly governing it. His reign had been marked by institutional competence, maintaining what Albert I built, by wartime survival through accommodation, and by personal inadequacy that prevented Monaco from developing during a period when development was desperately needed. Louis II was not a bad man. He was an incompetent prince who held a title he never earned and responsibilities he never met. His grandson, Rainier III, inherited in 1949 at age 26. Young, educated, ambitious, Rainier understood that Monaco needed comprehensive modernization to survive in the post-war world. The casino model that had saved Monaco in the 1860s was insufficient for the 1950s. The principality needed diversification, infrastructure improvement, and an image transformation that would attract new forms of wealth and investment. Rainier III would rule Monaco for 56 years, longer than any Grimaldi since the dynasty began. He would save Monaco from post-war decline through ruthless pragmatism and one brilliant decision: marrying an American film star who would make Monaco famous worldwide while also bringing personal tragedy that would haunt the family for generations. The pattern was about to repeat again. Success through transformation, prosperity built on calculated risk, and personal cost that seemed to always accompany Grimaldi achievement. Rainier III became Prince of Monaco at age 26, facing a principality in serious decline. Casino revenues were half their pre-war levels. Infrastructure was deteriorating. Monaco's image was outdated. It was seen as a playground for aging European aristocracy rather than a destination for modern wealth. The principality needed comprehensive reform, and Rainier had ideas about how to achieve it. but ideas without capital were insufficient. Monaco needed money to rebuild, and traditional revenue sources were inadequate. Rainier's first priority was modernizing Monaco's economy. The casino remained important, but Rainier understood that dependence on gambling alone was dangerous. He wanted to diversify into real estate development, financial services, tourism beyond gambling, and light industry that could operate in Monaco's limited space. The vision was to transform Monaco from a casino town into a legitimate business center that happened to have a casino. Achieving this required constitutional reform. Monaco's constitution, established in the 19th century, gave the prince nearly absolute power, but also made Monaco appear autocratic to potential investors and international partners. Rainier proposed a new constitution that would establish representative government, a national council elected by Monegasque citizens, while preserving princely authority over key decisions. The balance was carefully calibrated. Enough democracy to satisfy modern expectations, enough princely power to allow decisive action. The new constitution was promulgated in 1962, but its development consumed much of the 1950s through negotiations with various constituencies. Monegasques wanted more voice in governance. France wanted assurances that Monaco would not become a tax haven threatening French interests. The Vatican, always concerned with Monaco's gambling revenues, wanted guarantees that Catholic social teaching would be respected. Rainier navigated these demands while maintaining the fundamental principle: Monaco would remain a sovereign principality under Grimaldi rule, but it would adopt modern governance structures that made it a credible international partner. Infrastructure development began immediately upon Rainier's accession. The port was expanded to accommodate larger vessels, including the luxury yachts that wealthy visitors increasingly owned. Roads were improved and expanded, the railway station was modernized, utilities were upgraded to support increased development. Every project required funding Monaco barely had, but Rainier understood that without infrastructure investment, Monaco could not attract the development he envisioned. He also tackled the palace itself. The prince's palace had been maintained, but not comprehensively renovated since the late 19th century. Many areas were outdated, uncomfortable, and inadequate for modern state functions. Rainier commissioned renovations that would continue through the 1950s and 1960s, modernizing systems while preserving historical character. The palace needed to function as both a working seat of government and a symbol of Monaco's continuity. Balancing those requirements was expensive and complicated, but Rainier prioritized it as essential to Monaco's image. But Rainier's most important insight was that Monaco needed a new narrative. The old story, tiny principality survives through cunning and casino revenues, was true but uninspiring. Monaco needed to become aspirational, a place people wanted to visit, not because of its past, but because of its future. The principality needed to represent something larger than itself: luxury, sophistication, success, European glamour translated into modern form. Creating that narrative required more than policy changes and infrastructure investment. It required a symbol, an individual who could embody Monaco's transformation and make the principality matter to people who had never visited and likely never would. Rainier needed someone who could make Monaco famous not just in Europe, but globally, particularly in America, where new wealth was expanding rapidly. By 1955, Rainier was searching for a wife. The search was not purely personal, though personal compatibility mattered. He needed a spouse who would enhance Monaco's image internationally, who understood public relations, and who could handle the scrutiny that came with being Monaco's princess. European aristocracy offered potential matches, but Rainier understood that marrying within traditional nobility would reinforce Monaco's old-fashioned image. He needed someone different, someone unexpected, someone the world would notice. That same year, 1955, an American film star named Grace Kelly was at the height of her career. She had won an Academy Award for The Country Girl. She was filming To Catch a Thief in Monaco in southern France. She was beautiful, famous, and represented everything about mid-century American glamour. She was also Catholic, which mattered for Monaco's relationship with the Vatican, and from a wealthy Philadelphia family, which meant she understood social expectations, even if she had achieved fame through acting rather than birth. The meeting between Rainier and Grace Kelly at the Cannes Film Festival in May 1955 was arranged as a publicity event. Grace was promoting To Catch a Thief. Rainier was promoting Monaco. The photo opportunity was supposed to last 15 minutes. It extended to hours. They continued corresponding after Grace returned to America. Within months, they were discussing marriage. The match was perfect from Monaco's perspective. Grace Kelly was known worldwide. Her marriage to a European prince would generate global media coverage. Monaco would transform overnight from an obscure principality into the setting for a real-life fairy tale. American tourists, who were becoming increasingly important as post-war prosperity allowed more Americans to travel internationally, would flock to Monaco to see where Grace Kelly had become a princess. From Grace's perspective, the match offered an escape from Hollywood's pressures, a role that would last beyond her film career, and entry into a world of tradition and formality that Hollywood could only imitate. She was also genuinely attracted to Rainier, and the prospect of being Monaco's princess appealed to her sense of romance and adventure. The engagement was announced in January 1956. The media response was unprecedented. Global coverage, magazine features, television specials. Monaco's name appeared in newspapers worldwide, often for the first time. The principality that had struggled for recognition became instantly famous. Rainier's strategy was working better than he had dared imagine. But amid the publicity and celebration, a darker pattern was emerging, one that Grace Kelly could not have known about, one that Rainier might not have fully understood himself. The Grimaldis had a history of marriages that started with hope and ended with tragedy. Grace was walking into a pattern 7 centuries old, and her fairy tale wedding would eventually become another chapter in the family's long story of personal cost paid for public success. The wedding was set for April 1956. Monaco was about to become famous. The Grimaldis were about to be transformed from minor European royalty into global celebrities. And Grace Kelly was about to discover that marrying a prince meant joining a family where happiness in marriage had been elusive for 700 years. April 18, 1956. The wedding of Prince Rainier III and Grace Kelly was not merely a ceremony. It was a global media event that transformed Monaco overnight from an obscure principality into one of the most famous places on Earth. Over 30 million people worldwide watched on television, unprecedented for the era. Newspapers devoted front pages to coverage. Magazines published special editions. Monaco, population under 20,000, became the center of global attention for a week. Grace arrived in Monaco on April 12th aboard the SS Constitution, a luxury ocean liner carrying her family, friends, Hollywood celebrities, and a press corps that numbered in the hundreds. The voyage itself was covered like a royal progression. Every detail was photographed, documented, analyzed. Grace's wedding dress, designed by MGM costume designer Helen Rose, was examined from sketches through fittings to final delivery. The dress itself, featuring 125-year-old Brussels lace, 25 yards of silk taffeta, and thousands of seed pearls, cost the equivalent of several $100,000 in today's money. The wedding festivities lasted a week, a civil ceremony on April 18 to satisfy Monaco's legal requirements, a religious ceremony on April 19 in the Cathedral of Our Lady Immaculate, attended by 600 guests, including European royalty, Hollywood stars, and diplomatic representatives from dozens of countries. The cathedral service was broadcast live on television and radio, allowing millions to witness Grace Kelly's transformation from American actress to European princess. The spectacle was everything Rainier had hoped for. Monaco received publicity worth millions in advertising value. The principality's name appeared in every major newspaper and magazine in the world. Tourism inquiries flooded Monaco's offices. The casino reported surging bookings for the summer season. Hotels were fully reserved months in advance. Monaco had become not just famous, but aspirational, a place that represented romance, glamour, and the possibility that fairy tales could be real. But behind the fairy tale, realities were more complicated. Grace had given up her film career as a condition of marriage. Her final film, High Society, had premiered just weeks before the wedding. MGM released her from her contract, but only after Rainier agreed that Grace would not return to acting. She was to be Monaco's princess, not a part-time royal who made movies between state functions. The sacrifice was substantial. Grace was 26 years old, at the height of her career, walking away from work she loved for a role that had no precedent and no clear definition. The adjustment to palace life was difficult from the beginning. Grace spoke minimal French when she arrived. Monaco's court operated in French. Official documents were in French. Conversations with staff, with dignitaries, with Monegasques were all conducted in a language Grace barely understood. She studied intensively, but the learning curve was steep and isolating. For months, she was surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone, because she could not communicate easily with anyone except Rainier and a few English-speaking staff members. The palace itself was challenging. The prince's palace was a working government facility as well as a residence. Tourists visited daily during the summer season. Privacy was limited. Grace's movements were observed and reported. The informal lifestyle she had known in America was impossible in Monaco, where protocol governed everything from meals to public appearances to how she addressed palace staff. The fairy tale wedding had delivered her to a gilded cage, beautiful but confining. Rainier, for his part, was consumed with Monaco's modernization. The publicity from the wedding had worked beyond his expectations, but now he needed to convert attention into sustained economic development. He was negotiating real estate projects, infrastructure improvements, and constitutional reforms. His schedule left little time for a new wife still learning to navigate an unfamiliar world. The marriage that had been engineered partly for Monaco's benefit now had to succeed on personal terms, and neither Rainier nor Grace had fully prepared for what that would require. Grace became pregnant within months of the wedding. Princess Charlene was born in January 1957, exactly 9 months after the religious ceremony. The timing was noted by press and public, causing some embarrassment given the implication that Grace might have been pregnant at the wedding, but Charlene's birth secured the succession and fulfilled one of Grace's primary duties. Monaco had an heir. The Grimaldi line would continue. Prince Albert followed in March 1958, a male heir, even more important for succession under Monaco's constitution. Princess Stéphanie was born in February 1965, completing the family. 3 children in 8 years, each birth celebrated publicly, each one reinforcing Monaco's image as a thriving principality with a flourishing royal family. The external image was perfect. The internal reality was increasingly strained. Grace struggled with depression through the 1960s. She missed acting. She found palace life restrictive. Her relationship with Rainier, never deeply romantic, became primarily professional, a partnership for Monaco's benefit rather than a marriage based on emotional intimacy. They maintained public appearances flawlessly, always photographed together at events, always projecting the image of a happy royal couple, but privately the distance grew. By the 1970s, Grace had found purpose in her role beyond childbearing. She became involved in charitable work, particularly organizations supporting the arts and children's causes. She joined the board of 20th Century Fox, maintaining a connection to the entertainment industry she had left. She narrated poetry readings and gave public performances that allowed her to use her talents in ways that did not violate her agreement not to return to acting. She was making the role work, but it required continuous adaptation and acceptance that the life she might have had was gone. The children grew up in an environment that was simultaneously privileged and suffocating. Caroline, as the eldest, felt the expectations most acutely. She was Monaco's heir apparent until Albert's birth displaced her in the succession. Even after Albert's birth, Caroline was under constant scrutiny. Her education, her friendships, her dating life, all were subjects of public fascination and press coverage that invaded any attempt at normal adolescence. Albert, as the male heir, carried different pressures. He would one day be Monaco's sovereign prince. His life was planned around that inevitability from birth: education at the best schools, military training with the French army, university studies in political science and economics. He was being prepared for a role he could not refuse and could not postpone. The weight of expectation was crushing for a child who had not chosen his destiny. Stéphanie, the youngest, seemed to receive slightly less scrutiny in childhood, but that would change dramatically as she reached adulthood. Born in 1965, she grew up during Monaco's most prosperous period, but also during her mother's increasing unhappiness. Stéphanie would later describe feeling like she could never please anyone, never meet expectations, never escape the comparison to her mother's fairy tale image. Through the 1970s, Rainier's modernization of Monaco succeeded economically. The principality attracted banks, real estate developers, and wealthy residents seeking tax advantages. Monaco's population grew. New construction filled available space. The casino remained profitable, but was now just one element of a diversified economy. Rainier had achieved his goal of transforming Monaco from a gambling town into a legitimate business center. But that success came with costs measured in his wife's unhappiness and his children's pressures. By 1982, Grace was 52 years old. She had been Monaco's princess for 26 years. Her children were young adults beginning their own lives. Her marriage to Rainier was functional but not fulfilling. She had found ways to make her role meaningful, but the sacrifice she had made in 1956 was always present. The question was whether she regretted it, whether, given the chance to choose again, she would have married Rainier and become Monaco's princess. She never had the opportunity to answer that question publicly. On September 13, 1982, Grace was driving from the family's country home at Rock Ogle back to Monaco. Her daughter Stéphanie was with her in the car. The road was steep, winding, and dangerous. Grace had driven it hundreds of times over 26 years. On this day, something went wrong. The car left the road, plunged down a slope, and crashed. Grace suffered severe injuries. She was rushed to Monaco Hospital but never regained consciousness. She died the next day, September 14, 1982. The official explanation was that Grace had suffered a stroke while driving, causing her to lose control of the vehicle. The medical evidence supported this conclusion, but questions persisted. Some witnesses suggested the car was traveling unusually fast. Others claimed to have seen Grace swerve as if trying to avoid something on the road. Stéphanie, who survived with injuries, gave conflicting accounts over the years about what happened in those final moments. The uncertainty fed speculation. Was it really a stroke, or was there something more? The truth may never be fully known, but the outcome was undeniable. Grace Kelly, who had become Princess Grace of Monaco in a fairy tale wedding watched by millions, was dead at 52. The marriage that was supposed to save Monaco and provide Grace with a life beyond Hollywood had ended in tragedy on a mountain road. The pattern that had claimed Grimaldi's for 7 centuries had claimed Grace too. Another princess dead young, another generation scarred by loss. The curse, if it existed, was unbroken. Grace's death devastated the family and Monaco. Rainier was broken. Whatever the true nature of their marriage, partnership more than romance, public performance more than private intimacy, Grace had been his partner for 26 years. She had made Monaco internationally famous. She had given him 3 children. She had adapted to a role she never fully chose. And now she was gone, suddenly, violently, leaving Rainier at 59 to face the rest of his life without her. The funeral on September 18, 1982, was watched by an estimated 100 million people worldwide, rivaling the viewership of the wedding 26 years earlier. The same cathedral where Grace had been married now hosted her funeral. European royalty attended. Hollywood sent representatives. Crowds lined Monaco's streets in tribute to a princess who had represented something larger than Monaco itself, the possibility that ordinary people could become extraordinary through love and choice. But inside the palace, the reality was grimmer. Rainier retreated into grief and work. He had always been most comfortable governing Monaco, and he threw himself into the principality's administration with renewed intensity. It was escape and coping mechanism simultaneously. He avoided discussing Grace, avoided the suite of rooms she had occupied, avoided dealing with the emotional devastation her death had caused. He would live another 23 years, but he would never fully recover. The children suffered differently but equally. Caroline, 25 at the time of her mother's death, had already experienced her own tragedies. She had married Philippe Junot in 1978, a marriage that ended in annulment in 1980 after it became clear Junot was unsuitable as Caroline's partner. The annulment was painful and public, another example of a Grimaldi marriage failing. In 1983, just a year after Grace's death, Caroline married Stefano Casaraghi, an Italian industrialist and sportsman. The marriage seemed happy. They had 3 children, Andrea, Charlotte, and Pierre. Caroline appeared to have found the stability that had eluded her in her first marriage. Then on October 3, 1990, Stefano was killed in a speedboat racing accident off the coast of Monaco. He was 30 years old. Caroline was widowed at 33 with 3 young children. The pattern repeated. Another Grimaldi marriage ended in tragedy. Another generation left to cope with sudden, violent loss. Caroline's life, which should have been one of privilege and happiness, was instead marked by death and grief before she turned 35. She eventually remarried in 1999, wedding Prince Ernst August of Hanover. The marriage gave her children a stepfather and Caroline a partner, but the relationship was troubled from the beginning. Ernst August had his own issues, including legal problems and public scandals. The marriage survived, but was never the happy ending Caroline deserved after so much loss. Albert, the heir, faced different challenges. As Monaco's future sovereign prince, he was expected to marry appropriately and produce legitimate heirs. But Albert was in no rush. Through the 1980s and 1990s, he dated but never committed. He enjoyed the lifestyle of a young prince, traveling, attending events, being photographed with beautiful women, without the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood. Rainier grew increasingly frustrated. Monaco needed Albert to secure the succession, but Albert was either unable or unwilling to settle into the role his position required. The situation became more complicated as paternity suits began appearing. In the early 2000s, multiple women came forward claiming Albert had fathered their children. DNA tests confirmed at least 2 illegitimate children, Jasmine Grace Grimaldi, born in 1992 to Tamar Rotolo, and Alexander Coast, born in 2003 to Nicole Coast. Albert acknowledged both children and provided financial support, but neither could inherit the throne under Monaco's constitution, which required legitimate birth. The revelations were embarrassing for Monaco and personally painful for Albert. He was in his 40s with acknowledged children who could not be his heirs and still unmarried. The pressure to find an appropriate wife and produce legitimate children intensified. But Albert's personal history made marriage difficult. His relationships had been casual, his lifestyle had been that of a perpetual bachelor. Transforming into a married prince committed to family life would require changes Albert seemed reluctant or unable to make. Stéphanie, the youngest, had the most publicly troubled life of the 3 children. She was only 17 when her mother died, sitting beside Grace in the car when it crashed. Some accounts suggest Stéphanie was actually driving, though this has never been confirmed. The trauma of the accident, combined with survivor's guilt and the loss of her mother at such a young age, affected Stéphanie profoundly. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Stéphanie pursued various careers, modeling, singing, fashion design, with mixed results. She had relationships that scandalized Monaco, including a long involvement with her bodyguard, Daniel Ducruet. They eventually married in 1995 and had 2 children, Louis and Pauline. The marriage was brief, ending in divorce in 1996 after photos surfaced of Ducruet with another woman. Stéphanie's reputation suffered even though she was the wronged party. She remarried in 2003 to a circus performer, Adonis Lopez Pérez. The marriage was annulled within a year. Stéphanie then had a relationship with another circus performer, Franco Knie, with whom she lived for several years. Throughout, she faced constant media scrutiny and public criticism for choices that would have been unremarkable for anyone not born a princess. But Stéphanie was a Grimaldi, and Grimaldis were expected to uphold standards that Stéphanie seemed determined to reject. By the early 2000s, all 3 of Grace and Rainier's children had experienced failed marriages, personal tragedies, or public scandals. None had found the happiness that should have come with their privilege. The pattern that began in 1297 was playing out again in modern form. The palace that was supposed to be the seat of Monaco's power was instead a place where happiness went to die. Rainier watched his children struggle and was powerless to help them. He had saved Monaco economically, he had modernized the principality, he had made the Grimaldis internationally famous, but he could not give his children happy lives, could not protect them from the same forces that had destroyed Grimaldi marriages for 7 centuries, could not break the pattern that seemed to follow his family generation after generation. By 2005, Rainier was 81 years old and in declining health. He had ruled Monaco for 56 years, the longest reign in Grimaldi history. He had transformed a nearly bankrupt principality into one of the wealthiest places on earth. He had married a woman who made Monaco famous and lost her in a car crash. He had raised 3 children who had all known tragedy. He had witnessed the curse, if curses existed, claim another generation. He died on April 6, 2005, at the palace that had been his home and workplace for over half a century. Albert, now 47 years old, unmarried, with acknowledged illegitimate children but no legitimate heirs, inherited a prosperous principality and a family history that suggested his own marriage, whenever it finally happened, would likely end badly. The pattern showed no signs of breaking. Albert II became sovereign prince of Monaco on April 6, 2005, at age 47. He had waited longer to inherit than any Grimaldi since the dynasty began. His father, Rainier, had ruled for 56 years, and Albert had spent most of his adult life as heir apparent, trained for sovereignty but never actually exercising it. Now, suddenly, Monaco was his responsibility. All the expectations that had been building for decades were finally his to meet or fail. The first challenge was immediate and practical. Monaco's succession required a legitimate heir. Albert had two acknowledged illegitimate children, but neither could inherit under Monaco's constitution. At 47, unmarried, with a history of relationships that had never led to marriage, Albert needed to secure the succession quickly. The pressure was immense. Personal, political, and historical. If Albert died without a legitimate heir, Monaco's succession would become contested, potentially ending Grimaldi rule after 7 centuries. Albert's first years as prince were marked by attempts to modernize Monaco while maintaining the traditions his father had established. He focused on environmental issues, positioning Monaco as a leader in marine conservation and climate change awareness. He established the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation to support environmental and humanitarian causes. He was trying to give his reign a defining purpose beyond merely inheriting and maintaining what Rainier had built. But the personal question persisted. When would Albert marry? Who would he marry? The speculation consumed Monaco's press and international tabloids. Names were floated, relationships were scrutinized. Every woman Albert was seen with became a potential future princess. The pressure was not merely about producing an heir, it was about Albert finally accepting the full responsibilities of his position, which included family as well as governance. The answer came in 2010 when Albert announced his engagement to Charlene Wittstock, a South African Olympic swimmer. Charlene was 32, 15 years younger than Albert. She was beautiful, athletic, and had been dating Albert since 2006. The engagement seemed to satisfy all requirements. Charlene was appropriate in background and temperament. She was young enough to have children. She seemed genuinely fond of Albert. The wedding was set for July 2011. Then rumors began. Reports surfaced that Charlene had tried to flee Monaco before the wedding, that she had been at the airport attempting to leave when palace officials stopped her. The reports were never confirmed, but they persisted. Charlene denied them, but her demeanor at pre-wedding events suggested someone under enormous stress. Was she a willing bride, or was she trapped by circumstances? Pregnancy, commitment, pressure into a marriage she did not want. The wedding proceeded on July 2, 2011, civil ceremony on July 1st, religious ceremony on July 2nd, exactly following the pattern of Rainier and Grace's wedding 55 years earlier. The comparison was inevitable and uncomfortable. Another prince marrying for Monaco's benefit, another bride who seemed uncertain about what she was entering, another fairy tale wedding that might be covering darker realities. Photographs from the religious ceremony captured Charlene crying during the service. The images were published worldwide. Were they tears of joy, as palace officials claimed, or tears of someone realizing the enormity of what she had just committed to? The uncertainty mirrored the questions that had surrounded Grace decades earlier. The pattern was repeating visually as well as structurally. Charlene struggled with her role from the beginning. She was isolated, cut off from her former life, living in a palace where protocol governed everything. She spoke limited French when she arrived and had to learn while also adapting to royal duties and public scrutiny. The parallels to Grace's experience were striking and ominous. If the pattern held, Charlene's marriage would be marked by unhappiness regardless of the wealth and privilege that came with being Monaco's princess. In December 2014, Charlene gave birth to twins, Prince Jacques and Princess Gabriella. The births secured the succession and fulfilled Charlene's primary duty. Jacques, as the male twin, would inherit despite being born minutes after his sister. Monaco had an heir. The Grimaldi line would continue for another generation. But securing succession and achieving marital happiness were separate things, and the latter seemed as elusive as ever. Through the mid-2010s, Charlene's unhappiness became increasingly visible. She was photographed looking distant at events. She gave interviews discussing the challenges of her role. She spent extended periods away from Monaco, officially for charitable work, but raising questions about the state of her marriage. Albert seemed focused on governance, and Charlene seemed trapped in a role she had not fully understood when she accepted it. By 2020, the marriage appeared to be in crisis. Charlene spent much of the year in South Africa, officially for conservation work, but remaining there even as months passed. In 2021, she developed medical complications from a sinus infection that required multiple surgeries, keeping her in South Africa even longer. The separation from Albert and the children extended to nearly a year, fueling speculation that the medical issues were convenient excuses for a princess who wanted to escape Monaco. She eventually returned in late 2021, but immediately checked into a treatment facility in Switzerland for what was described as exhaustion and emotional issues. She remained there for months, separated from Albert and the twins, receiving treatment that palace officials described as necessary for her health, but declined to detail. The situation was unprecedented. Monaco's princess was essentially gone, living in a Swiss facility while Albert governed alone and raised their children with palace staff. Charlene returned to Monaco in 2022 and resumed public duties, but the marriage appeared to be an arrangement rather than a partnership. They appeared together at official events, they maintained the public facade, but the emotional distance was visible to anyone watching. Albert had finally married and produced heirs, securing Monaco's succession, but at what cost to Charlene? And what did it say about the Grimaldi curse that another princess was visibly unhappy, isolated, and struggling with a role that was supposed to be privileged? The pattern that began in 1297 was playing out again. Another generation, another princess, another marriage that looked perfect externally but was troubled internally. 7 centuries of Grimaldi rule, and the family still could not achieve lasting happiness in marriage. The curse, whether supernatural or simply the inevitable result of treating marriage as political necessity rather than personal choice, remained unbroken. Is there actually a curse on the House of Grimaldi, or is the pattern of unhappy marriages and tragic deaths simply the result of human factors, arranged marriages, intense pressure, isolation, and the fundamental incompatibility between personal happiness and dynastic duty? The legend dates to 1297, the year François Grimaldi took Monaco through deception. According to folklore, a woman, sometimes described as a witch, sometimes as a victim of Grimaldi violence, cursed the family as she died or as she was cast out. The words vary in different tellings, but the essence is consistent. Never will a Grimaldi find true happiness in marriage. 7 centuries later, the pattern suggests something is at work, whether supernatural or psychological. Consider the evidence chronologically. From 1297 through 1600, multiple Grimaldi princes died young, often violently, often betrayed by family members. Marriages produced heirs but rarely produced happiness. Many ended in death, annulment, or separation. The pattern was established early and reinforced through generations. The 17th through 19th centuries saw some variation. Longer reigns suggested stability, but examination of individual marriages shows ongoing problems. Honoré II's first marriage ended unhappily. His grandson Louis I waited decades to inherit and died after a brief reign. The succession frequently passed to children requiring regencies or to adults already advanced in age. Normal family life, loving marriages, children raised by both parents, multiple generations living to old age, was rare. The 20th century brought the pattern into full visibility through media coverage. Albert I's marriages both failed. Louis II was incompetent and unhappy. Rainier II married Grace Kelly in what appeared to be a fairy tale, but was actually a complex partnership that involved significant sacrifice from Grace and ended in her death at 52. Their 3 children, Caroline, Albert, Stefania, have collectively experienced multiple failed marriages, tragic deaths of spouses, and public scandals. Not one has achieved sustained happiness. Now, Albert II's marriage to Charlene appears to be following the same pattern. Initial hope followed by visible strain, isolation, and unhappiness. Whether it ends in divorce, separation, or simply years of maintained facade remains to be seen. But it does not appear to be a happy marriage, and that alone continues the pattern. The psychological explanation is compelling. Grimaldi marriages have rarely been love matches. They were alliances, arrangements designed to benefit Monaco politically or financially. François Grimaldi married to secure support. Medieval Grimaldis married to form alliances with Italian families. Later Grimaldis married to connect with French or Spanish nobility. Even Rainier's marriage to Grace, though it appeared romantic, was substantially motivated by Monaco's need for international publicity. When marriage is strategic rather than personal, happiness becomes secondary to functionality. Does the marriage produce heirs? Does it strengthen alliances? Does it benefit the principality? Those questions matter more than whether the individuals involved love each other or are compatible as partners. The result is marriages that function politically while failing personally. The isolation is also significant. Monaco is tiny. The Grimaldi family lives under constant observation. Privacy is limited. Every relationship is scrutinized. Every difficulty becomes public. The pressure is immense and unrelenting. Even strong marriages would struggle under such conditions. Arranged marriages, entered into for dynastic reasons, have almost no chance of weathering the scrutiny and pressure. The women who marry into the Grimaldi family face particular challenges. They give up their previous lives completely. They must adapt to Monaco's culture, learn French if they do not speak it, accept protocol that governs their every movement, and live under media coverage that allows no privacy. Grace struggled with this. Charlene is struggling with it now. Caroline's marriages have been marked by tragedy and difficulty. The role of Grimaldi princess seems almost designed to create unhappiness. The men face different but equally challenging pressures. They are raised knowing they will rule Monaco. Their lives are planned around that inevitability. They cannot pursue careers or interests that conflict with Monaco's needs. They must marry appropriately and produce heirs. Personal preference is secondary to duty. Albert resisted marriage until 53, suggesting how much he dreaded accepting that aspect of his role. But resistance only delayed the inevitable. He eventually married, and the marriage has been troubled. So, is there a curse? In supernatural terms, probably not, but in practical terms, absolutely. The structure of Grimaldi life, strategic marriages, intense pressure, constant scrutiny, isolation, and the subordination of personal happiness to dynastic duty creates conditions where lasting happiness is nearly impossible. The curse is built into the role itself. Being a Grimaldi prince or princess means accepting that your life is not fully your own, that duty supersedes desire, and that happiness is something you hope to achieve within severe constraints rather than something you can pursue freely. 7 centuries of this pattern suggests it is not breaking anytime soon. The Grimaldis survive as a dynasty precisely because they prioritize survival over happiness. They make the sacrifices necessary to maintain their rule. They endure unhappy marriages if those marriages produce heirs and maintain stability. They adapt to circumstances that would destroy families less committed to dynastic continuity. But the cost is measured in the lives lived rather than the titles held. Rainier ruled successfully for 56 years, but lost his wife to a car crash and watched his children struggle through failed marriages and personal tragedy. Albert has secured the succession but appears trapped in a marriage that satisfies political requirements while failing to provide personal fulfillment. The next generation, Jacques and Gabriella, Caroline's children, Stephanie's children, will face the same pattern unless something fundamental changes about what being a Grimaldi means. The curse, real or constructed, continues because the circumstances that create it continue. Until the Grimaldis find a way to prioritize personal happiness alongside dynastic duty, until they create space for love marriages rather than strategic alliances, until they accept that some things matter more than 7 centuries of unbroken rule, the pattern will persist. Another generation will discover that living in the Prince's Palace of Monaco comes with costs that wealth and privilege cannot compensate for.